I've never seen so many people afraid of a game or so detached from reality. You know what players love? They love it when a game developer tells them that their favorite game, one of the most popular and successful and beloved games in the past decade, isn't going to have any impact on how games are made. Just because you like it doesn't mean we're going to learn anything from it. Why would we do that? That makes too much sense. I've always viewed Baldur's Gate 3 as a cultural turning point. It was a game that was so far a cut above the rest. It was so fair to the players. It was so jam-packed full of value that by contrast, it just made the rest of the industry look goofy. Players are looking at some of these other games and saying, what are you guys doing over here? I think it showed a lot of people, it opened their eyes to what a AAA game should be, what their money is actually worth, and it reminded them what it feels like to be the priority when a game is made. So imagine my dismay when I find another game developer, a well-known game developer, talking about how Baldur's Gate 3 is an unrealistic standard that the rest of this industry just will not be able to reach. And to be honest, that's actually relatively accurate. But they're trying to set a standard. They're trying to tell us what that standard truly is, trying to lower our expectations. You know, it's funny. The standard is only unrealistic when it's us that's asking for it. But before that, a word from today's sponsor, Raycon. And I'm going to gush about this for a second. I just got back from the gym, and this is the first time a pair of earbuds have actually stayed in my ears. For whatever reason, didn't matter what brand, one of my ears, it would just always fall out. This is the first time I found a brand that actually stays in. You don't understand how happy I am. I've been loving my Raycons, and now I'm going to be buying a pair for my mother for Mother's Day. If you're anything like me, I like to gift something she'll actually use, not just once before it disappears, and I think Raycon's everyday earbuds are a great choice. Whether your mom's running errands, hitting the gym, or multitasking like a madwoman, she deserves crystal clear sound that keeps up with her pace. These things have 32 hours of battery life, quick charging for 90 minutes of playback in just 10 minutes, and active noise cancellation, so she can finally enjoy whatever she's listening to without interruption. Personally, I'm using mine every day now, hitting the gym, going for a run, or while I'm editing videos, trying to drown out my neighbor mowing their lawn in the background. They're comfortable, they never fall out, and they charge quickly, which is really nice for me because I forget to charge things. Now, if your mom is picky like mine, Raycon does have a 30-day happiness guarantee. No questions asked. Go to buyraycon.com/legendary drops to get 20% off site-wide. And yes, every order supports the channel directly, so grab a pair for your mom or buy a pair for yourself. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring today's video. I owe a lot to Baldur's Gate 3. If it weren't for Larian Studios and the hundreds of hours I've now spent in their game, I don't think I would have understand what modern games could be, what they should be, how players deserve to be treated, what fairness looks like, how a budget can be used efficiently, how a team can manage itself effectively, and what happens when a studio genuinely understands its audience. In fact, most of the commentary and critique that I've done on this channel started with a video called Baldur's Gate 3 is a wake-up call. That's now over a year ago. Don't go and watch it or anything. I was incredibly dramatic, and I didn't have a beard at the time, but it was the first moment that I had realized just how far gone this industry was, and it was the first time that I found my voice as a creator. Now, the video that I had made was focused on a piece from GameDeveloper.com titled Yelling is Not Journalism, and it was a plea for empathy after pushback from a series of viral tweets where indie developers were asking players not to compare their game to Baldur's Gate 3, which on its own was a pretty harmless request. Nobody's out here screaming, why can't Schedule 1 let me romance Brad like Baldur's Gate 3 lets me romance a bear? That was never the issue. The issue was who responded to those tweets. Senior level AAA developers, producers, directors chiming in to say the exact same thing, that Baldur's Gate 3 was an impossible standard, that it's unfair to compare other games to it, which in hindsight was basically a soft confession because some of those developers, like Josh Sawyer of Obsidian and Chris Balzer of Blizzard, would then go on to release games like Avowed or Diablo 4. After seeing those games, I get why they don't want to make the comparison. The article itself tried to explain why we get broken, unfinished games, why DLC and microtransactions are necessary for them to finish them, why you, the paying customer, should feel empathy for these studios when you don't get what you paid for, as if being ripped off is just a part of the process and understanding it is somehow going to make it okay. It was without question one of the most tone-deaf attempts at gaslighting and damage control that I've seen from both the media and game developers, and it was all sparked by how popular Baldur's Gate 3 became. Despite launching right next to Starfield, it completely eclipsed it. It peaked over 875,000 concurrent players on Steam and sold 15 million copies in its first year, a global phenomenon that no one, except the people that were playing it in early access, like myself, could see coming. What no one could have predicted, though, is how long that momentum would last. Baldur's Gate 3 has probably sold over 20 million copies by now. It's still at the center of almost every conversation about games, and somehow, nearly 2 years after release, it's still averaging over 100,000 players on Steam as a single-player game. That number just spiked again with the release of Patch 8. When a game has that kind of staying power, that kind of cultural significance, it makes perfect sense why developers feel threatened. And of course, they're doing what they always do when something makes them look bad: downplay it, deflect, and gaslight players into thinking that it was never realistic to begin with. I came across an article from PC Gamer titled "Former BioWare Producer Says Baldur's Gate 3's Impact on Game Dev Will Be Somewhat Muted Thanks to Industry Convention," and I can't help but think we got it all backwards. In it, we get a summary of a YouTube video by Mark Dara, former BioWare executive producer and consultant on Dragon Age: The Veilguard. In that video, Dara makes the case that Baldur's Gate 3 may have been wildly successful, but its influence on the broader industry will be minimal, muted, to use his term. Dara opens by making the argument that sometimes there are games that sell very well but ultimately don't really have an impact on the overall game development landscape, or games in general in terms of what gets made, but also, the reverse happens as well. Games that were not as successful had an impact on the game industry much larger than their initial impact. And sure, in a vacuum, that's technically true. He brings up examples like KOTOR, Mass Effect, which defined genres but weren't colossal financial successes. But then he brings up Defense of the Ancients, Dota of all games, as a game that is overshadowed by its legacy, despite it inspiring countless copycats while still being one of the most played games on Steam. And for me, that's where that logic completely collapses on itself, because he turns around and argues that Baldur's Gate 3, a game that sold over 15 million copies, swept every Game of the Year award, and is now still one of the most played games on Steam years after its release, somehow that game won't have a comparable influence like KOTOR or Mass Effect, because the game is too much of an anomaly. According to him, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, it looks like the perfect storm of factors working together to make this game work, some of which are externalities that aren't something another studio can replicate. So let me get this straight. The only reason why you believe that Baldur's Gate 3 won't influence the industry is because you believe it's a one-time thing that nobody else could achieve? That's not nuance, that's deflection. Dara then starts pointing out those external factors, and you guys want to take a wild guess as what they're going to be? Oh, it's because it had the Dungeons & Dragons license. That's what it is. He says it's using the Dungeons & Dragons IP at arguably the peak of its popularity in service of making something that replicates the experience of playing D&D at the tabletop. I'm sorry, guys, but what does that have to do with anything? Now you're talking about why you think the game was popular and why it sold well in a broader discussion on how it will impact games in the future. Red herring moment, but okay, shows how little you understand the situation. So where was all that magic when Dark Alliance launched? Or Sword Coast Legends, or Chronicles of Mystara? They all had the D&D branding too, but they all completely flopped. Gotham Knights had Batman, Avengers had Marvel, Suicide Squad had the entire DC brand. None of them succeeded because branding doesn't make the game, execution does. D&D isn't what sold Baldur's Gate 3, quality did. Then we get to the most frustrating part, Dara's soft insinuation that Larian's budget made the whole thing possible. He says, it really isn't about having a ginormous budget or having a long time to develop, though it did have a very comfortable budget and it did have a long time to develop. Excuse me, what? So it really isn't about that, but it actually is all about that? What are you talking about? You know, this all sounds harmless until you realize how misleading it is. Larian made Baldur's Gate 3 for around $100 million over the course of 7 years. That includes marketing, QA, everything. Compare that to the $200 million or $300 million budgets we've seen out of Ubisoft, EA, Activision, Blizzard, and more for games that are shipping broken, unfinished, and utterly lifeless. Dragon Age: The Veilguard was in development for 10 years. You worked on that, Dara. I guarantee you spent more than $100 million. What happened there? This isn't about money, it's about competent leadership and knowing what your audience actually wants. He then goes on to bring up the so-called untouchable games, ones that he claims that the industry quietly acknowledges but then walks away from. According to him, what actually happened for the most part is the industry acknowledges the existence of games like Grand Theft Auto 5, acknowledges the existence of games like The Wind Waker, but then sets them aside and allows them to be their own things off on their own, and not attempt to make games that are directly competitive with them. This is one of the most historically inaccurate things that I think I've ever read from a developer. Grand Theft Auto 5 literally wrote the book on live service monetization. It changed how nearly every studio has handled online content, microtransactions, and engagement loops. Beyond that, he's strawmanning a single title's release and not the broader impact of the entire series. While Grand Theft Auto 5 exploded, every single Grand Theft Auto game is done well. And without Grand Theft Auto, we don't have Watch Dogs or Mafia. We don't get Cyberpunk 2077. I mean, if you want more recent examples, what about Breath of the Wild? That game reshaped exploration and traversal mechanics in open world games. You can see its fingerprints on everything from Genshin Impact to Immortals Phoenix Rising to Sonic Frontiers to just about any game out there. And here's where Dara tries to put a bow on the argument. And he says that in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, you would expect a 30 out of 10 impact. And we may see something more like a 5 or 6. It'll have impact. It'll influence RPGs going forward. I just expect that influence will be somewhat muted. And there it is. There's the narrative they want to push. Yes, Baldur's Gate 3 was great, but don't get your hopes up. It's not going to change anything. And of course they're saying that because if it did change anything, if it did become the standard, well, then they would have to answer why their games aren't measuring up. And they're not ready to do that because they would have to admit that the problem isn't the genre, it's not the audience, it's not the budget, it's them. I genuinely feel like the industry at large is trying to purposefully misinterpret the players. Impact does not mean carbon copies. It means shifts in design philosophy, genre expectations, and audience demand. All of those things that have already been triggered by Baldur's Gate 3. Players are already asking why other RPGs are not giving them the same level of freedom, polish, or respect. But Dara and many others want to paint this game as unreachable, not to temper expectations, but to create distance. They want to put up a wall between them and accountability, because if this game really is just some lightning in a bottle moment, then they don't have to learn anything from it. They can keep doing what they're doing. They can keep burning hundreds of millions of dollars on trash, talentless games while insisting that they're giving players exactly what they want. I mean, this is exactly why Baldur's Gate 3 hit the way that it did. It wasn't just good, it was a revelation. It was a game that made people realize what had been stolen from them over the past decade. All the systems that had been stripped away, all the content that had been turned into DLC or microtransactions, all the bugs, crashes, delays, and half-finished promises. Suddenly, they had something that respected their time, their money, and their intelligence, and you better bet they're going to remember that. This wasn't some niche project that hit harder than expected. This was the market correcting itself. This was players saying enough. And the fact that we have some developers that can look at that and still say this won't change anything is honestly surreal. Let's stop acting like Baldur's Gate 3 is in some untouchable bubble. Let's stop acting like it didn't leave a crater in the ground the size of a small country. Its success will shape this industry. Maybe not overnight, maybe not in ways we can immediately measure, but chronically, absolutely. And trying to deny that, especially if you're a developer working on RPGs, that's not humility, it's fear, and we can smell it. At the end of the day, players do not want to hear we can't do that. They want to hear we're going to learn from this. They want to hear that the success of Baldur's Gate 3 lit a fire under somebody's ass, that it got meetings canceled, that it got ideas reevaluated, that maybe, just maybe, someone finally asked, are we actually making something good? But I guess that would require some real introspection, and clearly, for some people in this industry, that's just too high of a standard. I don't think that there is a game that is more loved and feared than Baldur's Gate 3. It is wild to me that you would look at a game that is the first game ever in history to win every single Game of the Year award, and you're somehow thinking that that game isn't going to impact games in the future. I'm immediately remembering all the conversations back about a year ago where they're talking about the scope, the fidelity, all the choices that you have, trying to strawman these arguments on what player expectations are. Guys, for some odd reason, we can't do it. What's the D&D IP? That's what it has to be. Yeah, see, we can't do it because of the D&D IP. Sorry about that. Yeah. All of it. Literally all of it, ignoring what the player's expectations really are, where that shift in expectations went. It wasn't fidelity. It wasn't scope. It wasn't how long you could play the game. It was the fact that players got their money out of a game that they bought. They saw that it was a full effort. They could feel that it was a game that wasn't made purely for profit, that it kept them at the forefront of their mind. They were the priority when that game was being made. They finally got a damn good video game and realized how many of these AAA games are ripping them off while asking for the same amount of money. That's the problem. That's where the standards shifted to. How do you not notice that? And the thing is that even if for whatever reason Baldur's Gate 3 is this impossible game to replicate, and for whatever reason you cannot let it influence your games because of just how special it is, it doesn't matter. You don't get to tell players what the standard is. The one that is spending the money on the game does. You don't get to redefine that. You don't get to tell me what to expect. That's not how this works. You can't shift that. It's called reality. Every time I see conversations like this, I don't think they realize how much it destroys their credibility. These are people in leadership roles. These are people leading teams, directors and producers that are having these kind of conversations, that are trying to skirt accountability. What does that mean for the people that are working underneath them? How does that influence them in the games that they then work on, or the games and the teams that they end up leading when they get promoted with more years in the industry? You want to know where the sickness comes from? This is where it is. They would much rather believe that Baldur's Gate 3 is a freak of nature than admit they don't have the talent to give you what you want. I find it almost poetic that Dara, the very same man that consulted on Dragon Age the Veilguard, now chooses to release a video explaining why Baldur's Gate 3 won't actually impact future games. This is the second time now that he's released a video attempting to soften players' expectations. Not long ago, he had posted a video arguing that paying $70 for a video game doesn't entitle you to be cruel to developers, using online extremists as a straw man in a broader discussion about customer dissatisfaction. He tried his best to blur the chain of command, telling players that you don't know who's responsible for what, implying that most criticism is misdirected or uninformed. You know, you're welcome to be mad, just not mad at us. That was the overall message. Both videos have something in common. They deflect, gaslight, and obfuscate issues. They shield projects like Veilguard from fair comparison and criticism, and, well, regardless of whatever he says, it's not going to work. Players are going to compare, they will complain, and they are going to make demands. You don't get to tell them what the standard should be. You don't get to tell them this is the bar, that was the exception. The market decides that. The players decide that. And if they decide that Baldur's Gate 3 is the gold standard now, then every RPG is going to be judged by it, no matter how uncomfortable that is for you. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think anything said by Dara or the media or any of these other developers is out of malice. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction, like when you watch a little kid break something and they don't know how it happened, and in the same breath, they turn around and tell you that they didn't do it. This was never about Baldur's Gate 3 being too ambitious or too unique to be able to replicate. That's just a story that they tell themselves to avoid facing reality. Larian made a game that delivered more quality, freedom, and value than most studios can manage with triple the budget and development time. It didn't take 10 years. It didn't cost $300 million. It didn't have to hide behind a live service model, and it didn't have to crumble under the weight of sensitive themes. In fact, in a lot of ways, Baldur's Gate 3 embraced them, and it still walked away as one of the most beloved games in the last decade. And that's exactly why it scares them, because if Baldur's Gate 3 becomes the new benchmark, then they can no longer blame player backlash on prejudice or say that their ambition was too unrealistic. They would have to admit that their games don't inspire loyalty or respect because they lack vision, leadership, and execution. They would have to come to terms with the fact that the problem isn't the audience, it's them. And that's probably the most threatening thing about Baldur's Gate 3 is that it completely unraveled the narrative that most player criticism, especially towards games like Dragon Age the Veilguard, is rooted in bigotry or fear of progress. Baldur's Gate 3 showed that when players are pushing back on writing, tones, themes, or inclusivity, it's not because they're afraid of diversity, it's because more times, more often than not, they're responding to the quality of the game. And while there will always be some bad faith actors online, the vast majority of players are just tired of being sold bloated, condescending, and poorly made games. Baldur's Gate 3 was one of the most progressive, inclusive, player-liberating games ever made, and it's also one of the most beloved. You could romance whoever you wanted. You could customize everything from pronouns to anatomy. You could be anyone, kill anyone, bang anyone. You could do whatever you wanted. It didn't matter what your worldview was because the game welcomed you in. It didn't preach. It didn't lecture. It just gave you freedom, options, nuance, and respect. Larian didn't condescend to players. They didn't wrap their game in corporate messaging. They made the game that they wanted to make, but they also listened. They engaged. They showed humility. They put in the work. They understood that you can't make a game for everyone, but you can make a game that everyone can play. It didn't turn representation into a spectacle. It didn't frame every female character as a victim of oppression or force Carlock to be some metaphor for identity politics. It didn't sand down its cast to be bland, androgynous archetypes or drain them of charisma just to be able to make some statement about beauty standards. Instead, they gave us characters who felt real, emotional, flawed, magnetic, sometimes messy, sometimes noble. Larian understood that people are drawn to things that are aesthetically pleasing. It's okay to make characters hot. Compelling character design doesn't need to be sacrificed to avoid imaginary outrage. Seriously, game developers, the only people that are complaining about characters being too hot online are just engagement farmers on Twitter. Most people don't care about this. Anybody else is just looking for validation. It's not real. Larian didn't preach or pander. They simply built a world full of people that you actually wanted to spend time with. And that respect for the player's time, taste, and imagination is exactly why the game resonated across such a wide audience. That's the lesson to be learned here. That's the standard that we are asking for. That's why Baldur's Gate 3 succeeded where others failed. Inclusion is not the issue. It never was. The problem is when inclusion becomes a substitute for substance, when the studio's ideology replaces craftsmanship, when the message takes priority over mechanics, performance, enjoyment, and immersion. That's the problem. And when you think about it, Veilguard, like many other games, blew through all of those red lights. Tone-deaf characters that were written so poorly that they do more damage than they uplift the causes that they're trying to represent. Writing, visuals, and tonal shifts that seem like they were just trying to piss people off rather than excite players. Gameplay and combat that felt so boring, you wonder if they threw it in last minute. It is no surprise to me that Dara wants to create distance between games like that and Baldur's Gate 3 because they don't have the vision, respect, or the skill to be able to match or even try to keep up with them. So of course they want to distance themselves because if you line these games up side by side, the contrast is brutal. And the worst part is Larian didn't just make something better than them, they kept making it better over and over again. Baldur's Gate 3 didn't just meet expectations, it shattered them, but it did it through incredible leadership, smart project management, and relentless post-launch support. There is nothing unique here, nothing unachievable, only things that require competence and care. Look at what Larian has added since launch. Alternate endings, a photo mode, gameplay modes, new encounters, tons of quality of life features, character-specific dialogue, fully voiced cut content, 12 new subclasses, each with their own unique abilities, implications, and interactions, and now full mod support, including a browser and a toolkit. They didn't just make a great game and then support it, they nurtured it, they elevated it. Players have begged to be able to pay them more money. They've asked for expansions, DLC, anything, and Larian said no. They refused to monetize the game further. No microtransactions, no battle passes, just a complete experience sold once, and they made it better with time. That is unheard of. Larian isn't just creating a product, they are building a relationship. That is the difference between them and a lot of games that we've seen. They've been engaging with their audience from the start. They watched the discourse, they paid attention to feedback, and they responded. Not with corporate press releases, but with full-blown panels from hell, insanely produced live streams with music, comedy, dev insights, and raw, candid interaction. They didn't hide behind a logo, they stood in front of it. And they said, here's what we're doing, tell us what you think. Now we go and we compare this to how most studios operate: radio silence, condescension, microtransactions, tone-deaf games, self-inserts, NDAs and embargoes, carefully worded tweets, community managers either going after players or taking hits for leadership while they're hiding in the boardroom. Then when things go sideways, they act like the problem is us, our expectations, our tone, our unwillingness to give grace. But the truth is, grace was never the issue. It was quality, it was effort, it was respect for the player. Larian earned that by making a game for their audience, not against them. So when I see developers like Mark Dara trying to downplay that, it's not just frustrating, it's revealing. It tells me that this industry does not want to learn the right lessons. It wants to control the narrative. It wants to protect itself from hard truths. Dara and the rest of the industry aren't afraid of Baldur's Gate 3 because they think it's a fluke. They're afraid because it isn't one. It was competent, efficient, sincere, and it made a lot of games look lazy by comparison. Not because those teams didn't have money, not because they didn't have the D&D IP, but because they didn't have the direction. Or worse, they had the wrong one. The funny thing is, I don't think that Baldur's Gate 3 necessarily set a standard or rose the bar. I think it just reminded us that there was one in the first place. And that's probably the scariest thing for a lot of these publishers and developers, is because they don't really want to have that contrast shown between their games and another game, or for players to set a standard for them to be able to meet, because they know they likely can't meet it. They realize that in a lot of cases, a lot of these AAA games are effectively shovelware for $70, $80 going to be in the future. But Baldur's Gate 3 is always going to be a touchstone for me. It's going to be the game that I go back to when I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, when I feel like I'm getting too wrapped up in internet commentary and things like that. I'll go back to touch the digital grass of Faerun because, you know, in a lot of ways, a lot of these political, social political outrage moments in games and these issues that we see, while some of these things are definitely worth discussing, at the same time, a game like this flips all of that on its head and shows that at the end of the day, players really just care about quality. That's it. Quality, playability, enjoyment. That's the things that matter the most to players when they're buying a video game. The only reason some of these games aren't being criticized by their merits is because they had no merits to begin with. That was sacrificed by leadership because they weren't putting the players first. They weren't thinking about the player experience because they don't have the talent to in the first place. They're trying to change the world through art rather than making art that could change the world, if that makes any sense. It should. I hope it does at the very least. Even that shouldn't even be their concern. But if it is, you have to have your priorities straight. Larian has their priorities straight. Larian just has better management, stronger vision, stronger leadership. They just know what they're doing in comparison to the rest of the industry while they're all grasping at straws. Look, man, I'm just going to say this. Under no circumstances whatsoever do I want to hear from any developer that you're not going to learn anything off of Baldur's Gate 3. Nobody wants to hear that. I don't care what the circumstances are. I don't care how hard it was to make the game. I don't care how much money it cost to make the game. You need to learn from this. And I think it's showing that they want to push back against it. And they've been doing it for over a year now. Ever since the game released, they constantly want to talk about not only how great it is, but how they'll never be able to learn anything or implement anything or be inspired by it. I don't want to hear that. You're too far gone if you think success is something that you need to be afraid of. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys did enjoy the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the channel with your friends. Come follow me on Twitch, link down below. Stay cool, stay righteous, stay safe. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.
Family, 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 family.